Guten Morgen, meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, liebe Zuschauerinnen und Zuhörer. Good morning from the German House in New York City, and welcome to the third event of our series dealing with disinformation, jointly organized with the American Council on Germany. I'm David Gill, the Consul General of Germany here in New York, and it is my pleasure to welcome at least one of our two panelists, Tiffany Xu, and we will be joined by David Schraven later. He's on his virtual way to join us. Tiffany Xu is an award-winning reporter focusing on dis or misinformation for the New York Times since 2017. At the core of her role as a journalist, Tiffany has said, "My ability to report stories depends on my sources, and I strive to represent them accurately and protect them whenever necessary. I always aim to be fair while asking tough questions." End of quote. Wonderful quote. She holds an MBA and journalism master's degree from Columbia University, as well as a degree from UC Berkeley. Earlier in her career, she covered the Californian economy at the Los Angeles Times. Welcome, Tiffany.
Thank you.
Since 2014, David Schraven has led the investigative newsroom at Correctiv as a co-founder and publisher. The best advice David ever received in his childhood came from his mother. She said, "We did not set the boundaries of the world. Why would we stick to them?" It is the foundation for all his work as a journalist, whether it be mixing comics with journalism, bringing investigations to the theater, or working with hundreds of citizens to research topics at a local level. Earlier in his career, he wrote for well-known German media outlets such as the Taz, the Süddeutsche Zeitung, the Welt Group, and the blog Ruhrbarone. He has received multiple awards for his work. I'm very much looking forward to your discussion, but before I would like to thank Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, for moderating the conversation. Steve is a dear friend of the Consulate and a key player in the German-American and transatlantic relationship. Thank you, Steve.
Lieber David, herzlichen Dank, many thanks. Let me just underscore how happy we are at the ACG to continue this collaboration with you and your colleagues at the German Consulate here in New York. I think it's fair to say that the previous events in our joint series dealing with disinformation have been truly fascinating, and I'm sure that today will not be any different. So a big thanks to you and your colleagues for helping prepare all of these events. I'm also delighted to welcome two award-winning journalists, Tiffany Xu and David Schraven, as we explore how we can meet the myriad challenges of disinformation. And I was just informed that David Schraven is on a train that's been delayed, but is on his way and will join us in just a couple of minutes, or at least as soon as he can. But I know that with Tiffany, we're in very good hands and can get started in our conversation. As I was thinking about today's event, I was really thinking about the incredible challenge and even danger that disinformation poses to our societies, and that it seems even when fact checkers and journalists work as hard as they can to debunk false narratives and to inform the public about the truth, about the facts, it's often very difficult to get reliable information. And it's sort of too bad that David Schraven is not with us at the moment, because I wanted to start with a quick icebreaker question to each of you, which is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how serious do you think the threat of disinformation is?
So I should probably preface by saying that since I cover it every single day, it's all I think about are lies and liars, that to me it seems like a problem to think about quite a bit. I am often told that I have a job that has quite a lot of security because there will always be disinformation. There always, to some extent, has been disinformation. It's easier to access now than ever before. It's easier to spread. That said, most researchers I talk to say that the majority of people recognize disinformation for what it is, that especially because of a surge in media literacy efforts over the past few years, to some extent coverage by myself and my peers, that there is awareness of disinformation, and to that extent, it might not work as well as it has in the past. So it's a tricky question, right? It's definitely something that is very, very concerning, but there's hope that there is a way to combat it.
Mm-hmm. And so as you think about how to combat it, and I think we'll get into some concrete examples of that. I guess you said in a way there's always been disinformation, but I feel like the velocity and volume has really increased in recent years. And I would love to hear you talk a little bit about how you see that dynamic playing out, even if there's an increased awareness that disinformation and misinformation exist.
Let me start with some definitions. First of all, disinformation is usually considered to be bad information that's purposely spread, often by governments, state agents, corporations, that sort of thing. Misinformation is what your crazy Uncle Bob tells you at the Thanksgiving table that he heard from some random person on Facebook. There's also malinformation that's usually considered to be like, deep fake pornography. It's information that, comes from a place that might be accurate, but it's used in a bad way. And I talk about definitions because propaganda is linked to all three of those different terms. That's been around since governments existed, right? Since people had a point of view that they wanted to impress on another group of people. What's happened really since 2016 is social media. Social media has made it far, far, far easier to create misinformation, disinformation, and spread it. And it's made people more receptive to it in a way. Ever since we moved from information channels being mostly filtered through centralized organizations, newspapers, TV channels, that sort of thing, to the sort of influencer and creator economy that we have now, disinformation has seen the avenues with which it can reach people just expand exponentially.
Mm-hmm. So as you think about what your concerns are you more concerned about the spread? Are you concerned about the content? Are you concerned about what people can do to sort of protect themselves from that disinformation?
I mean, it's all of the above. The spread is something that we're particularly interested in because, as many researchers point out, there are gatekeepers. The social media platforms are able, to some extent at least, to control the flow of information. So we're very interested in the kinds of steps and tactics that they take to address this problem. There have been lots of studies done on how receptive information consumers are to disinformation, and it seems that the consensus is there are many different mitigations available. There's fact checking, there's pre-bunking, there's content moderation, flagging, that sort of thing. But what a lot of researchers recently are telling me is that it kind of depends on the target audience, that mitigation need to be more customized to the person you're trying to teach.
Thank you. So now let me also welcome David Schraven. David, thank you for joining us. We literally just got started, and so I'm happy that you're able to be with us. I opened by asking Tiffany to share with us in broad brushstrokes how serious she thinks the threat of disinformation and misinformation is. because it seems as if it is a real challenge that permeates all parts of society. And I'd love to get your sense of how serious a threat you think it is.
Especially in Europe, the problem is, from my point of view, extremely serious. In the upcoming European elections, it's one of the drivers that's pushing Europe to a brink. When it comes to the Palestinian or Israeli conflict right now, you see a lot of disinformation campaigns that steer up the conflicts in our society. And from what we see as Correctiv, as a fact-checking organization, which is active here in Germany for 6-7 years, we see that it's not only just a couple of bad actors, but it's more or less organized campaigns that are addressing rifts in our society that there are, and they are exploiting these rifts very successfully, unfortunately.
And I think, Tiffany, you would probably say that one could come up with a similar narrative in the United States as well.
Absolutely. I mean, we're going into an election mega cycle globally next year. Something like a third of the world's population is going to vote in 2024. So, I mean, it's a referendum on democracy. It's a referendum on how the world's population is able to access and then process truth.
So particularly since both of you watch very closely what's happening in this area, and as Tiffany said before you got on, David, this is a topic that she works on every day, and that she follows lies and liars constantly. I'm sure that you probably feel the same way. One of our viewers is asking a somewhat provocative question about sort of the watchdogs who are keeping their eye on disinformation, and posits that those organizations trying to call out disinformation are doing so in a way that contributes to the disinformation rather than informs and makes aware of the disinformation that exists. Do either of you think that that's the case, that there's disinformation about disinformation?
May I start from what I see? Of course, bad actors are trying to smear us or starting smear campaigns. This is constantly happening. But on the other hand, there is enough studies on the backfire effect, and it says that there is none backfire effect, that it's not very a big risk or something. There's a study on that. And what I think what is more important is the trust in the methods of the Enlightenment process for the last 400 years. When the whole process of democracy started, and from enlightening and teaching, and the idea that the people themselves could rule themselves, we started 400 years ago. And it takes some time, and the democracies themselves, they are very, very slow. But in the end, they prevail because the methods are very good. And the method is, when it comes to facts, can you prove the fact or can you not prove the fact? If you invent something, you don't have proof. You lack everything that is necessary for you to prove something. And this is the reason why I think in the long run, all these efforts will prevail. We work a lot on media literacy. We work a lot in debunking. We started to work in pre-bunking campaigns. And in the end, people will understand and will make a difference. And this is a big trust we all have in democracies. And of course, it's tumultuous times. It's troublous sometimes not successful. Mm-hmm. But in the end, when you look back 400 years ago till now, we started in absolutism and we had kings. No, not so many kings anymore. So.
If I could just offer 3 examples to address this issue of the disingenuous disinformation gatekeeper. Obviously in the US, Jim Jordan is leading an effort to really target what he calls a disinformation economy, right? He has tried to intimidate researchers at institutions like Stanford, right? These are people who do vetted, rigorous scientific research on this sort of subject. That Jim Jordan and his crew have tried to paint them as people who are partisan, who have political, who are following a political agenda, right? So there's great risk to researchers in the U.S. and really around the world. Fact checkers in many countries that I've talked to have all said the same thing, which is without the ability to target the rigor of the research, you know, a lot of people are taking the next step, which is to target them. It's become a very ad hominem sort of attack. Taiwan, though, is an interesting example of how there might be some legitimacy to these concerns. You know, I wrote a story recently about Taiwan approaching its presidential election in January, and the government there has really made some pretty aggressive moves to tamp down on disinformation. And there are concerns that the government is going too far, right? That it's using these new laws or these new proposals as a way to silence opposition parties. You know, there are people there who say the Taiwanese media is diverse, right? It's very raucous, but it is diverse. And so some of these opinions that these disinformation laws are targeting are valid opinions, right? People can support Beijing. There are reasons that people might want to support Beijing, but these sorts of laws could prevent those opinions from being voiced. Finally, just to wrap up, and I apologize for rambling, but I'm consumed by this exact question. You know, I've been speaking to fact checkers in Israel and in Palestine on this subject, and what they say is, yes, they're very close to the conflict there. I mean, this is violence that's happening at their doorstep. So one could be forgiven for being concerned that maybe these fact checkers are biased, or you know, that they have particular sympathies toward one side or the other. But kind of the consensus that's come out is it's good when people are close to a subject, right? They're experts on the ground. They understand the cultural nuance. They understand the language. And when they're targeting or when they're dealing with a sort of controversial subject, what it does is it pulls in the fact-checking community from around the world, which improves the final product, right? Because more scrutiny tends to be better. So you have people who understand that there are cultural influences at play, that there are sympathies at play, and they take that into account when, as a global fact-checking community, they come together to look at a single topic and they kind of reach an aggregated truth.
Thank you. I actually have a couple of viewer questions that sort of tie right in with this, and that I'd love to pose to you. One viewer just wrote in, do you consider that part of combating disinformation is to build trust in the information? Could it be in having a balanced, could it contribute to having as balanced information as far as possible? And I guess the point that I'd like to get at with that is, how does one reinstill trust in the information that one consumes? David, you're nodding, so let me maybe come to you first, and then we can bring Tiffany in again.
Yeah, I think the approach is, it's not a single approach, it's a more-fold approach. One is very short-targeted. The short-targeted approach is just debunking. Somebody tells bullshit, which is without any fundamental issues or information, just invented lies, debunk. Just tell what is true and exactly where this disinformation happened to be. This is first very short-headed. Then you need something more complex. This is in pre-bunking, for example, make people aware of narratives that might occur in a couple of days or weeks. The next one is increase the media literacy of the people around your society. Make as many people as possible aware of what is the trusted information like? What do they need? How do they make a difference between a fact and opinion? And when an opinion is based on facts, is it an argument that is valid or not valid? Make them part of the discussion. And this is long-term. And then you've got something for the kids as well, you know. They need to address even bigger challenges when it comes to artificial intelligence and invented, but in a very proper way, invented information. So you need to make them aware for the next 20 or 30 years. And this is something, these media literacy needs that our societies have got. These needs to be addressed in very, very broad ways. But in the end, as I said before, this is exactly the same task we had 400 years ago when the book printing was invented. So we can learn from that, you know. Back then, we invented universities. Back then, we invented schools for kids in the kindergarten ages. In Germany, we had a law that everybody has got to attend a school, which was pretty good. And we need to invent this stuff again. You know, we need to improve our knowledge in the society. But it's possible. It's not impossible. It's just a lot of work.
Yeah, everything I've heard from researchers suggests that media literacy training early and often is key. There are interesting examples in like Finland, for example. School children are taught to kind of recognize the signs of a Russian troll. You know, in Taiwan, there are kind of citizen-led groups that try to teach older people to recognize the signs of disinformation. But you know, something that comes up quite a bit, and that is something to wrestle with, is striking the balance with media literacy, right? You want to teach people how to lateral read, for example, like reading multiple sources instead of just finding one source and relying only on that. But you also want to avoid what some people refer to as information nihilism, which is people becoming skeptical of all information and feeling like they can trust none of it. So it's a balance that's really quite tricky, but it's heartening to know that at least people recognize that that balance has to be struck.
So this is actually, no, go ahead, David.
Yeah. One thing I would like to add is here that exactly what Tiffany just said is one of the goals of the guys who spread this information. They want to rob us of the total concept of what is a fact, what is real information. They want us to believe in nothing. And this is exactly what Tiffany said. But again, this is deliver proofs with your story. And if you got the proof, if you can prove what you said, then it's valid information and people can understand that.
At the risk of veering quite suddenly into AI, but exactly off of what David was saying, there's this concept that's coming up a lot called the liar's dividend in artificial intelligence, which is basically that the very presence of artificial intelligence technology and the fact that people can access it is allowing a lot of people to say, this is not real footage, or like this is inauthentic. And this is coming up a lot in the Israel-Hamas conflict, which is that footage that most experts would agree is actually authentic footage, genuine footage, is being claimed instead as AI generated. So it offers it enables people to shirk accountability, basically, by playing with what kind of information people trust.
So I'd like to come back to AI in a little bit, but sort of look at how each of your two organizations have been affected by this and how you've evolved in terms of how you practice your craft. David, your team at Correctiv has really been working very actively against misinformation and disinformation. Obviously, there's a large media landscape in Germany. Why did you think it was important to add an organization like Correctiv to the mix?
First of all, we started not as a fact-checking organization, but as an investigative newsroom. And when I started it 10 years ago, I saw that in the traditional media landscape, the investigations I did were not possible anymore. In that way, I did it. And I said, okay, we need to start something new. We need to think new. We need to find new ways. And at that time, there was a lot of stuff going on in Korea with Newstopper, a very broad and very good news organization. There was ProPublica in the US, which was also like a lighthouse for us. And we said we try to do something similar but different in Germany as well. And we started it. And then we saw, okay, it's not even enough to just publish differently or investigate differently. You need to address the fact checking, you know. That was something that was 7 years ago, not in our minds. We said, of course, everybody understands the concept of facts and not facts on disinformation, but it was just not true. The Russians came and invented disinformation campaigns completely new, which was for all societies completely new. And the traditional media organizations were not able to react as quickly as was needed. So we did take this job. And then we started also a web academy to teach people the methods of fact-checking. And this became right now the biggest web academy in Europe with over 90,000 participants who regularly study how to counter disinformation or how to express themselves. And so we started with one thing, it came to another, and we went further. And it's by the needs, you know, we need to do it, otherwise it will be problematic.
So, I mean, there's been a real evolution in terms of what you've been working on and how Correctiv has grown. And I think it's fair to say, Tiffany, that there's been an evolution with you personally as well, right? I mean, you served as a media reporter previously and sort of drifted into this beat of covering misinformation and disinformation because of these developments. Can you talk a little bit about that shift for you, but also how coverage at the New York Times has changed over the last 5 to 7 years as this has become even more pervasive?
Yeah, I was doing a lot of coverage of right-wing media figures. You know, the folks at Fox. You know, the radio networks that lean more conservative, and disinformation was coming up a lot. I mean, a lot of people were voicing concerns that that demographic was more inclined, for whatever reason, to spread provably inaccurate narratives. I mean, most notably the election fraud narrative. And so the more I covered it, the more I found myself just writing stories about disinformation. And, you know, I'm very fortunate to work in an institution that has dedicated quite a substantial amount of resources to this topic. I mean, I'm part of a team. It's not just me. My colleagues, Stephen Lee Myers and Stuart Thompson, are also dedicated to coverage of this topic. And, you know, we work with a number of other colleagues very often. I mean, Shira Frankel was just in Israel covering the conflict. And I think what's evolved quite a bit is that coverage of this topic is multidisciplinary. It's very cross-section, right? So I'm often consulting with my colleagues in the climate desk, on politics, you know, in education. Disinformation is a subject that touches anything having to do with information, and because of that, it's a subject that touches everything.
So let me ask a quick follow-up that one of our viewers just posed. They write, what effect does the profit motive, which is so prevalent in the US media, have on disinformation as opposed to the largely publicly funded and independent news media found in Germany? Tiffany, you're nodding, so why don't you take a crack at that first, and then David?
I mean, the disinformation economy is something that we've tried to wrap our heads around. It's interesting because there are kind of the, you know, the dirty dozen of the COVID disinformation spreaders. There are people like Alex Jones. There are like big names in disinformation, in the disinformation ecosystem, and you know, they sell ads, they sell subscriptions, they like host conferences, they sell questionable vitamins, but really the money is coming from the long tail. of this ecosystem. And so it's been kind of difficult to pin down how exactly the money moves. It's just something that we constantly been thinking about. I mean, Haaretz actually, I think last year did a fantastic story about kind of the backroom dealings that power the ecosystem.
I would say in Germany, the money aspect is not the most important. I'm sure that some people make money out of these information campaigns, but it's not the most important part. And this might be the difference in the media system. In Germany, you've got a very strong public broadcasting system. You've got a lot of really strong regional newspapers. So maybe this is not the case, that it's a driving force in this disinformation campaigns. What we see more and more powerful are bad actors that comes from states. What we identified was Russia, which was very, very powerful.
Yeah.
And then you've got these disinformation campaigns in other languages than German in Germany, in Russian language, for example, or in Turkish language. Which we can't see. You know, the most German editors and reporters are blind on that. They don't speak Russian. They don't speak Turkish. They can't understand what is going on. They are not even in the social media ecosystems where these informations happen to be spread. And this is, from my perspective, the biggest challenge. On the bad actor side, you've got people with a big motive, let's say destroy the European Union. They've got money on their hands and blood, and they want to destroy it. And we as a society, we don't face it. We don't recognize that we are under attack, under information attack. And, you know, we talk about money and maybe they make money with it. Maybe somebody makes money with it, but it's a kind of a war. And the result of the war would be maybe that the right-wingers of the AfD will gain so much power that the European Union will collapse next year. You know, everything can happen. Yeah. We've got elections with Le Pen next year. If she will be the winner of the European elections, I wonder if the European Union will survive next year. And this is what is at stake. And that's the reason why I think that the state actors are more important.
You know, you've both pointed out how important disinformation is when it comes to the upcoming elections in the US, in Germany, across Europe, around the world, indeed. And maybe we should really think about disinformation and election campaigns as a completely separate conversation. But you've also talked about how pervasive disinformation is. Tiffany, I think you used the term multidisciplinary or cross-sectional. And one of our viewers asks how, or is curious, sort of how thick the fog of disinformation actually is, and then goes on to ask whether people who are not very interested in politics can escape the clutches of disinformation. Given the pervasiveness, I think I know what your response is, but can you each talk a little bit about how this is about more than just what happens in politics?
Yeah, I can start. Stephen, you and I were talking earlier about a story that I did ahead of COP28. You know, the massive climate conference that happens every year, and it's currently or recently took place in Dubai, right? I guess you could say that because this is a meeting of world leaders that it touches on politics, but really this is a story about climate, and the many layers of climate related disinformation are just incredibly thick, right? There are people who say that, well, humans are not responsible for climate change. That's not true. That wildfires in Europe were started by migrants committing arson. My favorite is the very broad-reaching conspiracy theory that warnings about the environment are a hoax created by authoritarian elites because they want to destabilize the global south and force everyone into lockdowns and force them to eat insects and lab-grown food. I mean, what that particular conspiracy theory shows is that if you look at a lot of these false narratives, they end up being connected to other false narratives, right? And researchers have suggested that in some ways, people who are more conspiratorially minded will believe in more than one conspiracy theory, right? And that's why you get a lot of people who go down the rabbit hole, so to speak, that they're really entrenched. And so a lot of the disinformation watchdogs that I talk to say that they're not really focused on that population of people who are already inclined to believe these sorts of things. They're focused on the people who are questioning, who might be just at the cusp of encountering their first conspiracy theory. Maybe it's election fraud, for example, and they're trying to stop them from toppling over into this wide web of interconnected conspiracy theories and false narratives.
Yeah, what is to me very interesting is that sometimes these groups that are addressed by the disinformation campaigns are in a very local area. Let's say in the Ruhr Valley, in the Rust Belt of Germany, they are addressed by some absolutely bullshit nonsense. And like the oldest church was burned down to the ground by migrants. But it's the church, you can walk there, you can see it. The church is standing. There has nothing been burned down to the ground. It's just bullshit, completely made up bullshit. But it doesn't matter. People like to believe it. And that way, you've got a back and forth on disinformation in a neighborhood, in a local area. And suddenly, you've got fights about religion that are completely not to understand. But you start to understand it when you see that the misinformation was coming from state actors from Turkey, for example, in Turkish language. And they are forcing the Turks in this particular city to be victims of some kinds of street fights. And this is challenging. It's difficult, challenging.
So in the time we have left, I'd maybe like to bring it back to what we can actually do to as citizens, right, to try to protect ourselves against disinformation, how we can have a better informed public discourse. One of our viewers sort of asked the question of how we can scale up solutions. And in the course of our conversation, we've talked about a couple of measures that are already in place, like fact checking, pre-bunking and debunking, content moderation, media literacy. And I don't know that we need to take each of these in turn, but even if we just look at fact checking, this is a pretty time-consuming process, right? In some of what I was reading, I found the SIFT program, right, where you stop at first and reflect on what you're reading. You then investigate the source. You then try to find better coverage. And then you trace the claims and quotes and the media back to the original content. That's something that obviously professional fact checkers are doing, but it's hard as a consumer of information to do that for everything that one questions. Can you both talk a little bit about the fact-checking process and how you would recommend consumers of information to be more discerning in what they, what they believe, what they follow?
I think we already know a lot about the mechanics of disinformation and how it works and how it is spread. And we know a lot about the mechanics of the narratives and how they are built. And based on this knowledge, which we gained over the last couple of years, we, at least with Correctiv, we think we've probably found a way how to address this in Germany. In every German city, you need at least 2 people who are trained fact checkers. You've got around 2,000 cities with more than 20,000 inhabitants. That makes, let's say, 4,000 to 6,000 people you need to address on a local level every false narrative that there is going to be. On the other hand, we know that the narratives are exchanged between the bad actors. You know, they see what is working, what is not working. They do a lot of A/B testing. On the other hand, with the collection of these proof facts, with these debunked claims, you are able to grow a kind of a database where you have, you know, like in science, you've got proof beyond your stuff, proof beyond your fact checks. And so your database is growing and growing and growing. And then you've got 6,000 people all across Germany in a local area who can work with this database in their neighborhoods with their people around them, with their communities, and they will just stop every wave of disinformation. It just takes a lot of time. It's like science, you know, you need to invent first universities, and then you need to invent schools, but it works. And this is most important, that it works.
Yeah.
I think David's description of kind of a local solution is key here, because I could do a story on fact-checking communities in every country or in every city, and they would all be totally different. And the point that I'm making is that I don't think there's a centralized solution to teaching media literacy, right? Because depending on where you are, depending on the demographic you're talking about, depending on the language you're speaking in, the solutions are going to be different, right? There are certain populations that are going to respond better to a pre-bunk than they are to a red flag that a social media content moderator puts up. There are people who are going to benefit more from in-person trainings as opposed to, you know, like a video game centered around facts. And I hope this doesn't come across as a cop-out answer, but it really does have to be quite tailored, is the understanding that I'm getting from researchers. And I think it's tempting to put the onus on information consumers, but the information ecosystem is an ecosystem, right? There are many players participating. And so I think legislators have a major role in this. Social media platforms have a major role in this. The fact-checking community has a major role in this. And the information consumers are only part of it.
So I understand that. Go ahead, David. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, just one thing I would like to add. What is so important and what we can work with, these are the lines of trust, you know. People tend to trust each other. People tend to say, okay, if it's true what he says, I will believe him, you know, the particular person. So we need to strengthen these persons in their communities. And if everybody understands and agrees on the methods, then you can work with these people as teachers, you know, it works.
No, I think that's absolutely right. This is, at the end of the day, this is a question of trust. Which outlets does one trust? Which sources does one trust? But then it's understandable that some people find themselves in an information bubble because they've only surrounded themselves with the things that they trust and that they believe, which sometimes are accurate. And as we all know, sometimes people build a bubble that is full of disinformation and misinformation. And so that then brings us to this issue that we've touched on a couple of times in our conversation around media literacy and trying to promote greater media literacy. There's also a lot of talk about critical thinking. And I would almost say that while these are important tools against disinformation, there are huge questions about how to teach media literacy and where to teach media literacy. And I found it particularly interesting what you were saying, Tiffany, just now, that there's not really a one size fits all, that one has to tailor it and adapt it to different environments, and that it can vary from place to place. But I would think that there are some things that are constant when it comes to trying to teach and promote media literacy. Otherwise, I worry that it can almost become too distracting, right? If I'm fact-checking everything that I question, I could jump down a rabbit hole and get lost. And that's only the first news story I've read of the day. So I'd be really curious if either of you have any golden rules for media literacy, and any thoughts on where and how it should be taught across generations, because it's not just young people, it's really across generations that we have to be engaged in this.
I can be quick. I have two main rules that I tell everyone who asks this question. The first is to take it slow, right? Don't jump to conclusions. A lot of disinformation is designed to compel an emotional response. This is partly why there's so much disinformation around the Israel-Hamas conflict, because it is such a hot button issue, and people are reacting very quickly and very emotionally to it. So first, take it slow, take a breath, take a minute, think about how this information is making you feel, and then think about whether or not it makes sense to you. The second rule is to trace back to the source. So much disinformation is material that's been like manipulated, or it's been taken out of context, and it's spread in that form, right? If you can find the origin of a piece of content, it's easier. It's not always it's not always the end all be all. You can't always establish whether or not it's true, but it does make it much easier to discern the context around it.
I would add that if somebody's shouting, maybe he's lying. I think of this with Alex Jones. You know, he was so much shouting. It was fun to watch, by the way, but completely nonsense. And this is something I would recommend. If somebody's shouting, maybe he's just too loud for facts. On the other hand, when it comes to kids, especially for young or teenagers, I think it's very important to give them a voice, not only teach them how to use something, but really encourage them to use their voices, you know, to start communicating. And as soon as they start to communicating, they're learning on that way what is important, what is not important. And this is so encouraging. And this is changing the landscape in cities. I just want to give an example on that. We started a radio station for kids in the Rust Belt of Germany. And we have now 70 kids there working as youth reporters. They run their own radio program. They do the stories they like. And at the same time they produce their stories, they understand what is disinformation, what is reliable, what is not, what is important, what is not important. And that way they're changing all the kids in the area. And it's massive. They started now something, they call it a kids union. They started their own youth center, and they're changing their neighborhoods. And I talk about the town of Bottrop, which is the last coal mine city in Germany, and it's changing the city landscape. And these kids are now talking politics about, what do we want to change in our schools? How do we do renovations in our schools? And this is not only about fact-checking, then it's about communication, and this is for me the best way to get it.
It's a great anecdote. It's a great example of that, because it also brings in that trust component, right? These are young people talking to their peers, and they are trusting each other and trusting what they're hearing. But let me bring in sort of another thread, which each of you have touched on a little bit during the course of our conversation, and that is the role of social media, because of course, these kids are all consuming social media as well. If I understand correctly, Correctiv decided to leave Twitter, or now X, as a media company. I'd love to hear the rationale for why that was the case, and whether you would advise people to leave the platform as individuals.
Yes. I just saw a question on these backfire effect studies. I can share the studies with you later, and you can share it with the audience. I don't have it at hand. I need to copy paste it to you. When it comes, sorry, no, I was lost.
So so you can send me that information, and I'm happy to pass it on to the viewer. But I was asking about the role of social media and a little bit why Correctiv left Twitter, now X, and whether you would advise people to leave.
Yeah. For an organization, for me, I'm personally still on Twitter, but only for fun. You know, it's completely nonsense there. And okay, you can spend 10 minutes there a day and see some fun. For reliable information, it's utter nonsense. And for us, for news producers, it's harmful even for our content to be in that environment. And I recommend everybody who's doing business there, just leave it. What I think is the role of social media is declining. What I see here in Germany, it's not that important anymore. People are using, of course, they're spending a lot of time on TikTok, which is in Germany at least not very good, the role of TikTok. Especially when it comes to the Israel-Hamas war. It's disastrous even. Among the youngsters, it's spreading disinformation at a rate we can't debunk. It's too much. It's overwhelming. This is harmful. But overall, it's like people had enough, you know. They had enough of these Twitter stuff. They had enough of these Facebook campaigns. And they are not stupid. They learned it over time. And now they see, okay, there are some people talking about some stuff they're not interested in, and they ignore a lot. And when it comes to the media distribution within Germany, we saw that the overall decline in social media is so quick that we rely now on more traditional ways as newsletters, for example, or other means.
Tiffany, what are your thoughts on social media and the role that it plays in distributing disinformation? And what one can do to protect oneself?
Unless you have the rest of your life to ask me for my opinions, I don't have enough time to go into all the thoughts I have on social media. But let me focus on X just because it's been quite the year.
Yes,
it is still a valuable information source for very specific topics like sports. Apparently, X is still the predominant avenue for reliable sports information. Other than that, it's accessible. You know, we were talking a little bit earlier about the money component to disinformation, and X is a really interesting example in that obviously there's been an advertiser exodus, but not all of the advertisers are left, which goes to show that even on a platform that I think is now as provably toxic as X, it's still attractive to certain advertisers, right? So there will always be people who are willing to spend money to be next to that type of content. Is social media still important broadly? Hard to say. I mean, there's still many people who use it very frequently. We see a lot of disinformation migrating into the encrypted message apps, so the Telegrams, the WhatsApp, and obviously that's concerning because they're encrypted, right? We don't have a lot of visibility into that sort of thing. Beyond that, I mean, the study of this field is hard, right? Because if you're looking just at social media platforms, a lot of the countries are restricting API access for researchers, so it's hard to get insight into just how much bad content is on there. And so it's been tricky to kind of map the flow of where all this information is and where exactly it's going.
And maybe, you know, as we start to come to a close here, something that we haven't really talked about, but that I think ties in with social media is the role of deep fakes and the challenge posed by deep fakes. Obviously, this is something that can show up almost anywhere, but seems to show up a lot on Twitter, on TikTok. I'd be very curious to hear from each of you what your thoughts are on how one can do a better job of identifying a deep fake and really, you know, making sure that one does not take it to be a truth, right? Because one saw an image or one heard a voice that's been manipulated.
Yeah, what we see at the European fact checker community, there's an association, European Fact Checking Standards Network, and we just had a discussion on it in Brussels. And when it comes to video, we don't see, at least right now, a big problem. But when it comes to audio, it's really effective. It works. People, when they listen to something, they think it's true, and it might not be true.
Mhm.
And here we see the distribution of disinformation, especially when it comes to traditional news. So the disinformation will be delivered through a channel that seems to be legit news. You know, maybe somebody imposes as New York Times, as an audio, as a podcast from the New York Times, and you can't be sure whether it's true or not. And this is very effective in Europe.
In the Israel-Hamas conflict, we're hearing from most researchers that deepfakes themselves are not really a problem. It's the fact that it is possible to make them. And so it goes back to that liar's dividend thing I was talking about earlier. But what most researchers say is that at the moment, they're not too concerned about generative AI because it is so much easier to just Photoshop something than kind of create it from Midjourney. That said, they're worried about next year with the election mega cycle. The available detection technology is not great. They're frequently wrong. You know, like we did a story where we ran a Midjourney image of like a giant 20-foot Yeti man, and a bunch of the detectors told it was a real photo. So detection tech is not great. There are some tells. Some of the programs are still showing like people with blurry fingers, like text is not really legible, but the technology is advancing so quickly that that might be fixed. There are efforts to address like content provenance. So watermarking content at inception, creating kind of blockchain tracking abilities, whether or not that takes, hard to say. But yeah, to echo David, it sounds like deepfake videos, not a huge issue right now. Audio is already a problem. Imagery will likely become more of a problem.
Thank you both. You know, there are a couple of questions that have come in from viewers that take us in somewhat different directions, and we've covered a lot of this. But let me maybe close with one of our viewer questions who's asked about differences that you've observed in countries. You know, whether there are regional divides in terms of disinformation consumption. You're both nodding. I mean, I think Tiffany, you talked about this, that you know, when it comes to media literacy, one needs to develop different approaches in different areas. David, you were talking about some of the regional approaches that you've taken at Correctiv. Can each of you maybe in a minute or so sort of give us your sense of where you see these regional divides in the US and in Germany as something for us as observers to keep our eye on?
I can start. Fact checking is a global industry, but it's really uneven. It's much more mature in places like the US and in Europe, not so much in the Middle East and the global South. If you're talking about foreign state actors and spreading disinformation, Russia and China are both very, very focused on spreading disinformation campaigns in the global South, just because they're sitting ducks there. They don't have a robust fact-checking history. So that's definitely an area we're concerned about.
From my point of view, it's very interesting that especially Russia is testing disinformation campaigns in the global South, especially in Brazil. Then they do the A/B testing there, and then they found a very effective narrative. They take it to Europe. We had it several times over the course of the last 2 years that such campaigns suddenly appear in Italian newspapers or in Italian disinformation channels, and from there on, it makes its way through Europe. And these narratives, you know, the evolution of the narratives, this is a very interesting and international path to follow.
And obviously, this is a global phenomenon, but it has incredible nuances at the national and local level as well. Well, on behalf of both the American Council on Germany and the German Consulate here in New York, I just really want to thank you both. Tiffany Shu, David Schraven, Herzlichen Dank. Many, many thanks. This has been a very thought-provoking conversation, and certainly leaves me wanting to talk more about it. And we will be doing that as part of this series. But I really want to thank both of you for shedding some incredible light on this challenge that we face. Many, many thanks to both of you.
Thank you very much, and sorry for being so late. There was a train, 45 minutes late. Sorry.
You made it in the end,
German
and we had a good discussion. So thanks for racing to your office to be part of this.
Bye.
Thanks for having us.